Welcome to everyone who's joining. As you join, please feel free to put your name in the chat box, as well as the city and country that you're joining from. All right, looks like we have people from the UK, from Michigan and Iowa and US, Jamaica. I'm gonna give just another minute or two for people to join. I kind of see the numbers going up. From Canada. Thanks to everyone who is putting your names and location in the chat.
Annika from Trinidad.
Oh yeah.
I think you were on a training I did recently.
Why don't we just give one more minute for
Brisbane,
people
I've
to
been there
join.
four different times. Hey, all right, yeah, you were.
Philippines, hello. I do, someone asks, are we all muted? I believe so, it's a webinar format. So feel free to use the chat throughout the workshop for any questions or comments. I'll continue to monitor it. Oh, we have someone from South Korea. Great, so we've got people from all over. Okay, it seems like, well, there's some more people joining. All right, should we give it until 5 after, Scott?
I don't have a clock in front of me, so I'll let you be the
Okay.
timekeeper. Yes. Yes, you were, Annika. I think I remember your name.
All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to this session on the art and practice of listening to survivors of violence. We're really happy to have you join us for this session and also at CSW. I know many of you are probably also presenting workshops, and I'm really looking forward to partaking in some of those later this week. Wish we could all be in person as we usually are, but it's great that there's another way for us to join. I see someone in the chat saying it's hard to hear, so we'll be sure to speak up. It also may help to use headphones if you're having trouble hearing. That can sometimes help the audio, or just to check your internet connection if we're cutting out. So we'll start. I'll have Scott go ahead and introduce yourself first.
Okay, so my name is Scott Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs here in Duluth. We are a nonprofit agency that started in 1980 and have been running continuously since then. We are an intervention project, meaning that we don't have a shelter. That's not what we run. We provide interventions, what we would call a visitation center. a men's nonviolence program. And then we do lots of institutional change with government systems, creating policies and procedures and protocols so that when these cases come to their attention, they have a way of dealing with them in a consistent and victim-centered manner. So that's the bulk of what we do as an agency, is system change.
Thanks, Scott. I'm Laura Wilson. I'm an attorney with Global Rights for Women, and we're an NGO that partners with local organizations and governments around the world to advance women and girls' right to live free from violence through legal and systems change. So we work with partners on reforming laws, on analyzing and reforming laws to improve their protection of women and girls. We also do systems change in the sense of working with entire communities or criminal justice systems to try to improve their response together, which we'll be talking about a lot tonight. And we do some work here in the United States as well. We're doing a project in our own community, creating a coordinated community response in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we also run a men's nonviolence program called Pathways to Family Peace.
And we are sister programs.
We are. We work very closely together, so it's fun to be able to do this together.
Yeah.
So tonight we're going to aim to do three things with you. We'll be demonstrating the value of reforming institutions so that they're designed to meet the needs of the people they serve, rather than the other way around, trying to fit women who are victims of violence into a system as it currently operates. We'll be helping you to distinguish between what it means to do focus groups with survivors as opposed to other forms of data collection that are very common around the world. And we'll also talk about how to build victim experience into the development of law, policy, and practice as it relates to coordinated community response, which we will define and describe a little bit more in this presentation.
So what we're going to do in the beginning here is just kind of give you a bit of the landscape of when we go talk to victims, what is the framework that we're using that information within, and then we'll get into how we talk to victims and do these focus groups. So one of the things that both of our agencies are committed to is social change. We are not service agencies. In other words, we don't create services, and basically service agencies are the same from one year to the next. They're just providing a service. We're constantly looking for what the next gap is in the way that our community responds to this problem, either things that the offender is slipping through or that victims are falling through. So one of the things we understand is change is ongoing. For over 40 years, this agency has written grants, and not a single year have we done the same thing as we did it the year before. We're constantly reviewing what we do and coming up with new things that we didn't know we should be, because we're talking to the people that we serve constantly about the impact of what we do, the impact of what we created, and how we need to continue to reform that. It's one of those things where the minute you fix something, something else becomes visible that wasn't visible before you fixed it. And again, we've been doing this work in Duluth for 40 years, and it just feels like we're still on the outside of the onion, trying to work our way in. The next is approach it as a social problem, as opposed to a problem with an individual, right? When that man is sitting in a room with 14 other men who've committed domestic violence, we see them as being products of a social environment that created this problem that we have. It isn't Jim and Bob and Ari's problem. It is a problem that they all have a way of sharing collectively, and then that changes how we intervene, right? If it was an individual, then we would fix the individual, but we're trying to fix the community that creates this kind of ongoing violence against the victims that we serve. When we're organizing, we're ensuring that those who are subject to this kind of oppression, this ongoing battering domestic assault, that they have a hand in what we're creating. We're not, as a group of experts, going to sit down and decide what those people need, right? That is the antithesis of what we do here. Everything we start, from our men's nonviolence program to our police policy to our visitation center, all started with conversations with women about how to design those things. What did they need involved in that response to make it better for their lives, right? And engage in dialogue versus counsel and advise. Ellen Pence, who was my mentor, a woman who started in this agency, some of you may have heard of. One of the things that she said often was that as advocates, I think we've quit listening to women. As I travel the country and I do observations and meet other people, we just aren't listening to women anymore. We think we've developed a level of expertise, and we're telling women what they need. We're telling women what they should do, as opposed to working with them in partnership to figure out how to make that either that response or that the community that you all live in a better place. And then create experiences that are liberating rather than dominating. When we counsel and advise, we are imposing our thinking and our will on other people who don't have a hand or a vote into whether or not our idea is a good one. So when you have a government agency, for example, that decides what the solution is and then provides money for it, that's a dominating environment. They have not went to the people to find out if that idea is even good for what they need, right? Liberating interventions create collaborations and true partnerships to change the world that they live in. And then the Duluth model, which we'll talk about what it means in a second here, but it's informed and has always been part of it came out of the women's movement. And so there is no equal space in our communities. There's all kinds of ways that entitlement and privilege and power get used. When we're developing an intervention, say with a government agency, for example, or a school system, there are ways in which power gets used in that institution. We have to know what that is. And the best way to do that is talk to those subject to that power or that oppression and find out how it gets used, where it comes from. Is it used to punish? Is it used to control? Is it used to guide, right? All that, really having an analysis of what that power is before we enter into trying to change, say, policies or protocols. Integrate social or cultural context into the interventions. We spent 5 years working with the evangelical community, Christian community in our community, asking women what it was like to be battered within that particular environment or culture. And one of the things we heard was that that they didn't call the police. Why not? Well, because our pastor is our 911 call. Well, what happens if you call the police? Well, we might get judged by the rest of our community for bringing the secular community into our home when we should have went to the, right? So and they didn't have the power to make that decision. They were subject to it. So those are the kinds of things that as you're developing responses that you get from focus groups, you get from talking to the people who are experiencing it. Consciousness raising is what has been a core part of the women's movement, and it is a core part of what we do. We raise consciousness by having collective conversations with people, whether it be offenders or victims. And we don't come in with an answer, we come in with a question, and that the whole room wrestles with to figure out how best to do this. We want probation officers to go out and do unannounced visits to high-risk offenders. The first thing we did is go and talk to women about that experience. And as they did that, the women shared their own experiences and came up with ideas that they probably would not have come up with on their own. But because we did it collectively, they were able to build on each other's conversations and learnings to create a greater learning that we could have done, like I said, on our own. Alignment with those experiencing the violence, which I've already talked about, and then liberation, which again I've talked about. We are trying to liberate people, not just stop the violence. We want a different community down the road that we want to live in. as opposed to just changing one person's life. The Duluth model is often described, well, it's described in many ways, I should say. The Duluth model, what it really is a method of organizing. So most people who write about the Duluth model don't know this, and you'll get that from as you read about us from other authors. But the Duluth model truly is a method of organizing. It's how the power and control wheel was developed. It's how our men's nonviolence program was created. It's how our visitation center was created. It's how our women's program was created. This is what we do. We use as a foundation the experience of those subject to the violence to help us design something. And then we change policy and protocol based on that. So we institutionalize the change. So this just quickly, advocacy agencies in our response are the ones that guide, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. Victim experience provide the framework for designing and advising the work of the coordinated community response. We're going to talk a lot more about that. Interventions need to enhance and be linked to the work of the next agency processing the case. So when a 911 call taker takes an emergency call from a victim, the way that 911 call taker takes up that call needs to be designed in a way that enhances the next practitioner who's going to be on scene, which in this case would be law enforcement. So how does this response enhance the work of this response? And then once law enforcement gets done, how does that response enhance the court response or the pretrial release response? So again, you're always linking agencies by policy and protocol so that each agency is making it easier for the next agency to do their job. And then the focus is never on the individual worker. It's always on the system. We do not focus on low performer types of folks. If you got a police officer, for example, that's not performing up to standard, that's not our work. That is the law enforcement agency's work. Our work is to see how systems work. Are systems responding in a consistent way to this problem? And if not, what are the gaps and what needs to get fixed? So if we have the Duluth model approach, right, that method of organizing, what it organizes, what we use it to organize for is a coordinated response. So you see all these different community and government agencies that are coordinated in such a way that we all work together. We all have information sharing agreements. We have a consistent approach to the problem so that regardless of a victim or an offender touches one of these different agencies, we are all approaching that victim or offender from the same vantage point. So the message is always clear.
So Scott talked a little bit about the importance of this approach in keeping victims at the center of the intervention and at the center of what the system is trying to do, how it responds. And this graphic kind of gives a depiction of what it's like to be a survivor trying to access services or help when she's facing violence. If she calls the police, then she will quickly become connected to all of these other systems or impacted, having to make decisions about all of these other systems, from child protection to potentially filing a civil order for protection, to going through the criminal justice process, possibly not having the money to pay for her rent and facing eviction, dealing with custody or divorce. I know a survivor who recently said to me that after she left her abuser, she felt like it was almost harder dealing with the system than it was dealing with the abuse, because suddenly she was faced with, not only having had to make the decision, was it safe to leave? How would she leave? Where would she go? How would she, what would she tell her children when she was bringing them somewhere else? But also, suddenly she was getting all these letters in the mail and having to respond to all of these different things and having to think about, all of these different ways to protect her safety and her children's safety. So our aim is in this work is to ease that burden on the survivor, to make the system work for the survivor rather than making the survivor have to work so hard for her safety.
Right. And so if you got women in your community who are saying what, you know, what the woman that you were talking to said is, it's I'll just go back to him because at least he gave me some money, right? They're asking for the world from me, and I got to meet all their institutional timelines. And I've got a life to live, and I've got kids, and I'm on my own, and I don't have vacation time. And right, there's all of these barriers. And then on top of that, all these expectations with the systems, which all have different institutional timelines. That's what our work is. We want to find out what that reality is for her and her kids. And then we want to build that back into the system so that that burden is, as Laura said, can be lifted.
Scott, you and
Oh, sorry, that's me. Yeah. Coordinated community response. So this is, as it says, it's an interagency effort to change the climate of tolerance, right? We do that by institutionalizing, as I said earlier, practices, procedures, policies, laws, things that institutionalize the changes that we're making so that they're not contingent on individuals. This is how that agency now will run. And we want that to happen across the board, across all the agencies that respond to this problem. Now, when you have guys like we do, who come in, they've been convicted of domestic assault, and they're in our rehabilitation program, and they say to you, when I lived someplace else, the cops wouldn't even show up if she called, or if they did, I never got arrested. But now I moved to Duluth, and this feels like Minnesota, right? Like women have all the power because now they're being held accountable for what they're. That's that changing that climate of tolerance. That if you commit this crime here, we will be relentless in pursuing you until you realize that the consequences, that there will be repeated consequences to you for what you're doing, and always giving individuals the opportunity to change rather than just imposing a consequence on them. That's what we see as a coordinated response goal.
Yeah, and I'll just add that from Global Rights for Women, we're often partnering with women's organizations that are directly representing women, but also, or helping women, but also recognize this need for better coordination and institutionalization of policies and practices that will better support women. And so our role, obviously, going to another country is not to create this coordinated community response, but to build capacity with women's organizations and with local governments to develop this, with our support. And so, our I guess our approach is to use coordinated community response and apply it to building capacity of in other communities, and adapting it for the needs in those communities.
So this is getting into this conversation about victim input and advocacy. As I said, advocates coordinate the work of our CCR, partially because we are organized as advocates. We're the only entity in a community response that is organized to prioritize the safety of victims, right? That's what we do. And I would say nobody does it better. So when advocates, we are the most closely linked to victims' experience. We are experts about that. And we can take that information and bring it back to the system. So when we're sitting in a room with a group of law enforcement or a group of prosecutors or a group of judges, we are bringing the voices of those women into that room, and helping them understand the reality that we're trying to address. And that's why we coordinated. When I've seen, and I've been to a number of communities, where the criminal justice system, some agency within it, is coordinating the response. The conversations and what they focus on is quite different. And I'm not saying that they don't work. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but this is the risk, is listening to what they prioritize, and what they tend to prioritize is the problems as a system that these folks cause for them. Our dockets are full, our jails are full. You know, they're dangerous calls to go. Like, it's all about how do we work with these folks to make our jobs better, as opposed to what Laura said earlier, that we're trying to change the way the institutions respond so that they're more aligned with what victims need to get in and get that service met, as opposed to making her find her way into an institutional process. And that's the issue when government agencies will take the role of organizing a CCR. It really does oftentimes change the focus from victims to the system. And that's essentially what all of that is talking about.
So we wanted to touch a little bit before we get into the details of what are focus groups, how do we do them, and why do we choose that method. We wanted to touch on other methods of collecting information and how they differ. You know, there's a lot of work being put into gathering data about violence against women around the world, which is really important. And you know, data collection can really serve to understand the prevalence of violence against women in different communities and countries, to understand demographics, types of violence that are common, and where, you know, more resources maybe should be allocated. Where they differ is that you don't get the depth of knowledge about victims' lived experiences with surveys, for example, or other data, quantitative data collection tools that you do with focus groups. And we'll be talking a little bit more about why that's important, how you do that. And I think, especially when thinking about marginalized groups, such as women with disabilities, or the LGBTQ community, or migrant women who have less access to be able to, you know, fill out or get a survey, and may have fears about sharing their experiences with government institutions. The role of advocates in this process of interviewing and engaging victims is really, really essential to understanding those experiences. And sometimes with data collection, we can minimize the experience of people who are marginalized because, you know, we're not getting the data, right? We aren't hearing about these experiences, so maybe they don't exist. And that can be a big problem too.
Laura, can I just give an example?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, you know, a survey of victims whose partners are on probation, you'll find out that they are at risk, especially with high-risk offenders. And typically the offender has access to them, and that they've been assaulted more than once, right? You'll get that kind of that layout of what they're generally experiencing. But it doesn't tell you how to design what I mentioned earlier. If probation's going to go out and they're going to do these unannounced visits, it doesn't tell you how to do that. It doesn't tell you what women want you to do in response to that. So when we sit down in focus groups with women and we say, this is what we're thinking of doing, but we want your input. Is this even a good idea? If it is a good idea, why is it a good idea? And then if it is a good idea and we're going to do it, what things do we have to account for, right? And the women said, number one, when you come in as a probation agent into our home, don't have the conversation you're going to have with them in front of our kids. I don't want my kids hearing this conversation with their dad. So could you remove him from the space if my kids are around? Second thing is, if you come into the space at our house and I'm there, don't bring me into your conversation. You're there to talk to him, right? I can navigate that space and stay safe, But if you start asking me questions as a probation agent, you're going to put me at risk because everything I say could be the wrong thing. And then I'm going to have to deal with that after you leave. The third thing was that they said was essential was that when you come into the house and he's not there, and you've already developed a trust relationship with us. We're not going to tell you this if we don't trust you or we don't know you. But if you've been calling us and you've developed that relationship that you've been talking about, then we might be willing to show you his stash. What do you mean? Like we hadn't even had that as a question, right? They said, well, my partner has a stash of alcohol and he's not supposed to have it. And then another one said, and so I said, how many women here partners are using that are on probation? And all of them raised their hand. Okay. So they said that they'd be willing to show the agent where that stash was if they trusted them enough not to use that when they against them as victims. So in other words, they'd come into the house and they'd have to find it. They couldn't just say, oh, she showed it to me, because then they would compromise her safety. Every time we would go on these visits, they would look through the house for contraband, right? That wasn't supposed to be there. Now they would know exactly where to look to find it, and they would just end up finding it. So victims said, if we trust you enough, we're willing to show you that, but we're not going to show you that if we can't trust that you're not going to immediately run up the stairs and call him and tell him that he's got a warrant out for his arrest because he's got alcohol, right? Because then I'm in trouble. So that's stuff that you'll never get from a survey. So it isn't that surveys are bad. We really need them to look at the big picture, but the details of how to organize a response in your community, you're not going to get that from a survey. You're going to get that from talking to lots of women about that experience. So Paulo Freire is a Brazilian educator, anybody's from Brazil, that we have used for many, many years up here. And Paulo Freire came to Duluth in the mid-90s to help us work on using his process of education and dialogue with victims and offenders. And one of the things that he said that I really love is many political and educational plans have failed because their authors designed them according to their own personal views of reality, never once taking into account, except as mere objects of their actions, the people in a situation to whom their program was ostensibly directed, right? So we've all been there. If we work in any kind of government institution, we've got a plan, a new initiative that comes down, and then we're expected to execute that, and then we execute it, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work for the people that we're trying to serve, because the people who designed it never asked the people who they were serving what should be involved in that design. And this just happens over and over and over again. And that we want to do the antithesis of what Paulo Freire is criticizing here. We want to bring them in partnership and figure this out together. So as I mentioned, we do all kinds of focus groups from big questions like take us through the experience of a criminal justice system to doing focus groups on how women came to decide to leave. What was the continuum of that experience from saying, no, I'm not going to leave, no, it's my fault, to finally making that decision. We want to understand as many different aspects of that experience as possible. The diverse ways in which victims experience the violence, you'll get that from a series of focus groups. And depending upon how many different layers of oppression that a woman is experiencing, that will change how she experiences the violence from their partner. And we have to know that. What ways do institutional responses compromise the victim? So when this agency comes into your home, when child protection comes into your home for the first time, what do they do that makes you less safe, right? I don't know that. I'm not in that space. I have to go to the people who are and get that input. And then what do they do that improves it? So when they come in, is there anything that they did that actually helped? Because we don't want to lose that. We want to preserve anything that helps, but we want to change anything that compromises your safety. Um, Expose sources of the problems. Um, it's interesting when you do a focus group, they expose that this is a problem for them. But what you don't know is what the source of it typically is until you do more investigations. So what these focus groups do is kind of give you a list of things to, as advocates, to start investigating why is this a problem for these women, right? The women can tell you what the problem is, but you got to go do an investigation to find out why it is a problem. And that is it's almost, in my experience doing this for 21 years, it's almost never what I think it is when you start doing the investigation. And then you reduce the likelihood of unintended consequences, right? Duluth was one of the first places in the United States to have a mandatory arrest policy. You know, the first person arrested under our mandatory arrest policy was a victim who fought back. So when we, and that was before my time here, that was the first generation of our workers, but what they didn't know at the time was the reality that many women hit back or fight back when he's trying to dominate them. And how do we then take up resistive violence as opposed to dominating violence, right? And does justice mean something different for somebody who's resisting versus somebody who's dominating? All of those questions, all of that opened up a whole nother realm of organizing to build in mechanisms in every single agency that takes up now resistive violence when women use it, when they're being battered.
Scott, there's a important comment in the chat, which I think goes to that first point about the diverse ways that victims experience violence. The comment is, it changes from country to country. Cultural differences need to be taken into account as well. And this is really something that at Global Rights for Women, we found in a Eastern European country where we did focus groups and where women talked a lot about the extended family of their abusers participating in the abuse, which is not common in every country, but in countries where extended families live together or live in the same small town, for example, it can be really common. And that's something that I don't think we necessarily would have learned without sitting down with a group of women and talking about their experiences, and them, and women kind of, responding to each other about that and sharing that they had similar experiences. So that was a really good point, Fatma, in the chat.
So, and I want to build on that conversation with this slide here. So this is the power and control wheel. Many of you probably seen it, but this is one of the things I also know about our work here is that this wheel gets misinterpreted quite a bit and how to think about it. This is not a gender neutral wheel. This is not a wheel that tries to represent everybody's experience of domestic violence. This is a wheel that is specifically about how men use these tactics to dominate a female intimate partner, right? And the way that the over 200 women that participated in building this with the organizers in Duluth in the 1980s was that the physical and sexual violence on the outside ring is what holds these other tactics together. It's the threat of or the actual use of violence that changes the way emotional abuse happens in a home versus where emotional abuse might happen in a home where there's no fear and there's no violence. So they wanted to make that really clear. And they also wanted to make it clear that the power and control in the center was not something that their partners, they said that their partners necessarily desired, but they felt it was what they were entitled to. They were entitled to her submission. They were entitled to her deference and whenever they asked for it, because they were men in relationship with a woman. And this is what men get. Now, these tactics on this wheel are the tactics of oppression. When you look at how people are oppressed, regardless of the context, these are the tactics that get used. This is just how men who batter their female partners, this is how they use those tactics, right? They didn't invent oppressive tactics. They used them, right? So uh, it's again to Fatma's statement about how women experience this differently. When people apply to adapt this wheel to a different culture, often the tactics, and when I say the tactics, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using economic abuse, using children, those tend not to change. Those tend to be very much around the world. Victims experience those tactics being used. What changes is how they use them, how they justify them, right? And how they can leverage them within their culture or community. That's what tends to change. So if you go to our website, we have all kinds of wheels from different cultures and communities and languages that people have adapted. Sometimes they just translate it straight to what we have. Other times they've built an adaptation. Right now we have 3 different ones going, and the one that's out of domestic violence is happening in Canada. And it is a group that is, they're about finished with it. It is a wheel with these tactics that represents how women who are elected get marginalized because they're women in elected office. And I said, were these the tactics that the women talked about? And they said, yeah, even using children, using the women's children to convey messages of threat back to the elected official was part of those tactics of abuse. So yeah, it's one of the things that really makes this work fascinating, is to see all the different ways that people have discovered that men who batter use these things to get what they want.
Scott, there are a couple of questions in the chat about the power and control wheel.
Sure.
So the first is whether the power and control wheel is copyrighted.
It is, yes, but there's no cost to reprint it. So unless you're gonna adapt it or you're gonna use it in a money making kind of venture, but then it's just a conversation with us. So.
And it's available on the website. If you can, the web page is kind of small at the bottom there, but it is at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be sharing these slides too. And another question, based on your experience with women, do women ever experience economic violence alone, or is it always accompanied by other forms of oppression? How entangled are different forms of violence?
Oh, that's such a good question, and I wish I'd have thought of answering it before you asked it. So when women put this together, and when we talk to women now, they don't experience they don't get up and, okay, it's Tuesday, so I guess he's going to use intimidation today. And Wednesday he's going to use emotion. It doesn't happen that way. So what women experience is that he's using emotional abuse, coercion and threats, using children, and minimizing, denying, and blaming what he's doing all at the same time, right? That they're experiencing these things simultaneously, or he's using economic abuse and male privilege and isolation at the same time. He has taken her money. He has taken her phone from her so that she can't make contact with anybody outside of a rural property. And he's doing it because he believes that as the man, he gets to make those decisions. That is how she experiences it. That's how we as interveners need to understand that wheel, so that when we're talking to victims, we understand, as the person who asked the question just said, they're not experiencing one of these things at a time. They're experiencing multiple tactics at a time. And not every tactic that's out there is on this wheel. Spiritual abuse is a tactic that is not on the wheel, but is absolutely a very coercive tactic that men in faith traditions use against their partner.
Okay, thanks. I just want to acknowledge there's another great question about mandatory arrest policies, but I think I'll save that for the end if that's okay. We're definitely going to save some time for more discussion at the end.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of the framework of how we think about it. Now, many of you might have done focus groups, you might do it in a different way. I'm not saying this is the way, right? But this is the way that we've come to after all these decades of doing the work. And again, not all of this is all inclusive. This is where we kind of are going to focus. So if you're planning for the focus group, understand the system you're going to be interviewing the victims about. If you don't know what the criminal justice, if you don't know what the police do and how they process a domestic violence case, then you need to figure that out first. What are they currently doing, right? Go on ride-alongs, interview patrol officers, interview command, right? Learn what those officers are doing and why they're doing it first before you go into the room and start talking to the women so that you have particular questions you can ask. For example, I was in a focus group about law enforcement. I said, one of the things that I know is that law enforcement asks you if you want a call made to the shelter. And my question to you is that a good question? Well, what do you mean? Well, in some communities, the officer just makes the call. They don't ask the women if they want to. And one woman said, well, I said no. I said, why did you say no? And she said, because I thought the shelter was just about shelter. And I didn't need shelter because I had my own house. So I didn't need them. And another woman, and then pretty soon what we ended up with is the whole room, every woman in that focus group had told the officer no for different reasons because they thought the shelter was about shelter or order for protections or going to court, like all that stuff. But then all of them said they ended up working with the shelter eventually. And I said, so at the point that the officer is asking that question, did you know enough to answer that question, yes or no? And they all agreed that they did not, right? That they wish they would have said yes, because they would have more quickly lined up with an advocate and learned more about what they didn't know was going to happen to him and what the next step was and all of that. So their recommendation was, don't ask us, have the advocate call and we'll decide if we want to talk to her, rather than ask us if they should make. So now that is a fascinating, but I would have never known that if I didn't know that that's what officers do, right? Understand experiences victims have with abusers, right? Be really grounded in that so that, again, it helps you with the questions, the things that you need to know. Who should be invited to participate? We tend to ask women who have a little time between the war of dealing with him in the immediate circumstance versus a woman who's been out for a while and can look back on that with some analysis. What we've found is that women who are immersed in the struggle can say a lot about what's happening and who's doing what, but they have a harder time analyzing why it's all happening because they're just trying to survive. There are focus groups where that is very helpful, but if we're looking for input on how the criminal justice system's response worked or didn't work for somebody, or child protection worked or didn't work for somebody, we're looking for somebody with some distance so that they can look back and analyze where they were, why they're making the decisions that they made at the time versus what they would do now with what they know. That kind of stuff is really helpful. How many participants are enough is a question I get quite a bit. We're not researchers. We're not going out there and predetermining how many people we're going to have to talk to get a statistical number. We're talking to women until we quit hearing the same things over and over again, right? Sometimes that's 10 women. Sometimes that's 50 women, right? You just keep talking to women until you quit, so basically what you know is what all the women keep talking about, right? Then you know you've got enough. And you can start taking that and building it back into the system. What are your questions going to be, right? I usually think about 5 or 6 questions that are like in my head to frame the conversation. The rest of them, 90% of the questions are follow-up questions to what women are talking about, right? Understanding more about what they're giving you to the one question that was asked. Prepare releases and a recording device. We record all of our focus groups. We have never had a woman be uncomfortable with a recording device, except when they were talking about sexual assault or rape. Those women did not want to be recorded for obvious reasons, and they also did not want to be in a focus group. Most of them wanted to do individual conversations. So we will prepare the releases so that they know exactly what we will do, and what we will do is we will record that. That recording will go directly to a transcriber that we have in our agency, and that person will transcribe it. And as she transcribes it, she will redact it. So the only person who's actually going to read that transcription is the person doing the transcription. Everybody else who reads it is going to read a redacted copy so that no identifying information is in there. And that's in the release so that they know that. We also talk about how we might use what we get in there, the redacted version, as a training tool, right? And again, nothing would be used that would be identifying. Secure stipends, depending on where you are and what the cost of things are. Typically in Duluth, it's a $40 stipend for participating in a focus group. So we need to raise that money, right? When we write the grant, that's part of the grant request. Stipends for focus groups to make sure that we can pay women for their time. And it's not much, but it's what we can usually come up with. Food and beverages are available, obviously, when you get there as part of your rapport, right? Chips, and somebody brings something hot, and beverages, and there's a conversation before you begin, and then they can continue to snack as we go. And then staff available for, sorry, I can't see that. There we go. Good question, but I couldn't see my slide. Staff available for post-focus group processing. So if there are women in the focus group that telling their story was traumatic to the point where they would like somebody to talk to and kind of download afterwards, that you have staff available for the women to do that after the focus group is over. And then, of course, organize someone to transcribe. When you organize someone to transcribe, make sure that it is recorded in a way that the transcriber can use. Right? The transcriber will tell you how to record it in a way that they can use it. Don't do it. Don't just record it and then give it to them. It may not be in a format they can use. So make sure you have those conversations before you do it. The questions that you ask, agree on the framework for the questions among your team, right? The focus group, on the focus group, whatever team you put together of advocates, typically about what you want to know more of. Sometimes the system has something to say about that, but usually it's advocates that are putting that together. Like I said, 6 to 10 pre-planned questions. How should the questions be framed? So depending upon what the focus is, if it's criminal justice, what are you going to be asking about within the criminal system? If it's child protection, what part of child protection? There's many pieces to child protection. What part of it are you going to ask about, right? And stay focused on. Male or female facilitation of a focus group. Typically, I've not experienced a problem, and I co-facilitate it with a woman, and we're conducting the focus group together. It's worked. The only time that I would say that it is not something I've even attempted is again around sexual assault. Again, it's just a different space, and the women tended to want to talk to women, and again, not in a focus group, but in mostly individual conversations. And then group versus individual. Yeah, it really depends on what you're talking about. But most conversations we have about the system and how it responds are group, because you get a lot more from a group collective conversation than you do from individual conversation.
Yeah, I'll add to that there that we have done some individual interviews with survivors during COVID. Because of having to do them by Zoom, it's been much easier to organize, individual interviews rather than group conversations. Although I think you do lose something by not having the shared experiences and back and forth.
All right, so one of your handouts is a transcript, portion of a transcript of a focus group that I did about a criminal justice response. And the piece that you received as a handout is mostly focused on probation. So you'll be able to just use that as a practice tool if you haven't done this before. But what you want to do is once you've got your transcription in front of you, then you want to sit down with your team and everybody reads a portion of it. They're usually too long to do it one reading, but we'll take, say, the section on law enforcement and read that. And we'll all read that. And then we come and we jot down, every time I sit down with a focus group transcription, I got a highlighter and I got a pen. And I'm highlighting and I'm taking notes all the way through and looking for reoccurring themes that the women are talking about, right? Sometimes that includes government folks in that, but usually they don't want to take that time or don't have the time to take. And that's what we do. And then what Laura's going to talk about is what we do with those themes afterwards. Themes in the handout that you received. Women didn't know what was happening with the case or his post-conviction supervision. You're just going to get that over and over. Women keep saying, I didn't know, I didn't know, I didn't know. And what's interesting is what they did know is what he told them, the offender told them, right? So most of the women, what they understood was what the offender was telling them, not what people in the system were telling them. They psychologized the offenders. That was fascinating to us. How are all these women diagnosing the men's violence with bipolar or other kinds of mental health diagnoses, right? That's the problem. The women didn't see it as a problem. They just thought it was a reality. But we saw, how does that happen, right? And eventually we discovered the source of that problem from a mental health agency that was doing some stuff that wasn't, Well, they were basically taking men's referrals, not putting them in men's group and giving them a diagnosis and then treating them under a mental health plan that they could bill insurance with and make more money from. So, and then they were telling victims that they had a mental health problem. So that was where the source of that came from. We would have never discovered that had we not been in that focus group that I just talked about. Yeah, so you'll get those themes when you read it. So I don't need to cover the rest.
Yeah, and there have been a couple of questions in the chat about the documents. So my understanding is we uploaded the handouts and the PowerPoint to the CSW portal. So I believe that if you go to this session, you should see the files that have been uploaded and be able to download them from there. If that is not correct, or if someone knows that that doesn't work, please let me know and I'll find out how we can get you the documents. But I believe that's how it works.
Okay, so Diane just said, yes, you can. I'm assuming that she's agreeing with what you just said.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think if you go to your agenda on your portal, then there should be a place under each event for files. So please take a look there.
Okay.
Oh, there's a question related to what you just said, Scott. Offenders are psychologized by victims. What does this mean? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Okay, sorry. So the women, you're going to read this when you use the example, but the women kept saying that he's got mental health issues and he's not getting treatment for it. He's bipolar and I wish he could get treatment for it. Well, we know from research and from practice that there's no more a finding of mental health in men who batter than in the general population, right? So how did all these women in this focus group come to well, not all, most of them, come to this conclusion that the reason he was being this way is because he was mentally ill. He had bipolar, he had depression, whatever. So that's what I mean by psychologizing the violence, right? And then like I said, what we found out is that there was an agency that the criminal justice system was referring men to for rehabilitation, men's programming for their violence. And instead of putting them into that program, the mental health agency was doing a diagnostic assessment, coming up with a diagnosis, and then putting them into individual mental health treatment, which they could bill more for insurance than they could make off of a cash pay-as-you-go program that they were running for men's nonviolence programming. So, once we found that out, the criminal justice system in that community quit referring men to that program based on but we discovered that because of how women were talking about the violence that the men were using. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. I think so. So let me just, there's a couple other questions I see in the chat, and we will, like I said, we'll save some time at the end to be sure that we get to all the questions.
Yes, Joanna. Good. I'm glad I got it. Thanks.
Okay, so after you've gathered the information and had a chance to kind of organize it by theme or discover kind of what are the themes that are coming up from your conversations with women, what we do is to create a focus group report. So this is something that we can take back to the coordinated community response to review together and talk about. And our audience, we develop it for the people that are going to be analyzing this problem and looking for doing research to look for possible solutions. And I uploaded a copy of it's an excerpt of a real focus group report that Global Rights for Women did with a European country. And it's organized to include an explanation of the purpose of the focus group for folks that weren't involved in it, to describe the design, to give a little bit of not names or any identifying information of participants, but a little bit of demographic data about how many people were involved, their ages, whether or not they had children, and some answers to basic questions that we asked before really getting into the depth of the focus group, like whether or not they had ever called the police, whether they had worked with an advocacy organization. Then we described the data that was collected. So what was the scope? What were the questions that we asked? And then we provided a summary of findings that was organized by theme. In the report that you'll see, it's an excerpt. It includes, I think, 3 of the themes that were identified out of 6. And what we do is we include, quotations of women, not identifying who said each quote, but to illustrate how we came up with the theme. So you'll see that in the report, the first theme that's mentioned is that many women in this particular country had the experience that when they reported to the police, the violence was minimized. There were very slow response times by police, and oftentimes police pressured them to change their story or to minimize the violence in order to not have to make an arrest, essentially. So that's what we do in order to create a report that can be shared with others, so that we're not, not everybody in the coordinated community response has to sift through every single note that was made during the focus group or listen to the recording. But it gives people an idea of what the themes were that were identified that you can then work from.
And I just want to say too, Laura, that people will ask me, how do you get a government agency open to this idea of coordinating a response? I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't because somebody like myself goes in with all this wonderful insight and they just say, "Oh wow, that's fascinating. We should change the way we do what we work." Right? That's not how it goes. What motivates agencies is when you can bring the reality. So when your agency intervenes in the lives of these folks, this is what happens. Right? This is what's good. This is what's not so good. Right? And we want to work with you in partnership to figure out how to solve what the women are saying is how the officers marginalizing them in this response, right? And that people are open to, right? They don't get up at the beginning of the day and want to do work that makes it worse for people they serve, right? So when you bring the voices into that space, they're heard in a lot different way than they are from, say, experts who come in and tell them how the issue may be changing what they're doing.
Thanks. Yeah. We also wanted to touch a little bit on focus groups with women's advocates. So we've been talking directly with victims, but we also often do focus groups with women's advocates because, as Scott mentioned earlier, advocates are the people in the community, in the system, that are closest to women's lived experiences. They're working with women every day. They're experts in the sense that they've been down this journey and helped women down this journey many, many different times. They should not be considered a replacement for focus groups with victims. And oftentimes, around the world, I observe that it's common to engage women's NGOs, which is really, really important to have women's NGOs have a leadership role and a voice at the table when policy decisions are made. But oftentimes it seems that their voices are almost being used as a stand-in for victims. Like, we'll get the story about victims from the advocates rather than talking to victims themselves. They're not a replacement because they aren't living the experience. So they're helping women through a stage of their life. That doesn't mean that they were there for all of the abuse. That doesn't mean that they were there for this woman's whole life and understands all of her complex, experiences and needs. However, they can provide really valuable insight. And one thing, we just recently did a victims or an advocate focus group. And one thing I found most valuable was that we talked with some advocates who are really closely involved with how the police process cases. They actually are embedded in a police department. So they, in the investigations unit, so they receive all the police reports, they review them, they help officers follow up. And so they could really give us insight into how cases are actually processed. When is the protocol followed and when it's not. And also just some insight into the culture of the department. Are these cases valued? How do people talk about these cases that we just probably wouldn't hear from anyone else? They can also help us to further explore some of the themes raised by women. So Scott talked about how, you talk with enough women until they're kind of all bringing up the same themes. And advocates, I think, can add to that in the sense that they've worked with so many women, so they see these patterns in their work. And they can also help a coordinated community response understand why previous efforts at reform may have failed. So for example, in the focus group that we just did, advocates told us that for a long time, their approach was to basically create allies within the different precincts in the city. So they would find officers who they felt were good at working with victims, who cared about the issue, who were sensitive and responsive. And that's the person they would always call. But the problem is that in a lot of police departments around the world, including in this particular community, there's a lot of turnover. And so they were constantly having to do this, right? It wasn't really an institutional change. But it was kind of the best that they could do, just working on a daily basis on these cases. So that was helpful because when we first started meeting with this group of people, it was something that was brought up, kind of like, how can we raise up the people that are doing this well? How can we train on this problem? Maybe that's the solution. And it was a way for us to say, look, advocates have already tried this. They told us they've tried this over and over. So it's something else. It's something deeper than just training or just finding the good eggs or whatever. So do you want to add anything to that, Scott?
Just that, I'm just thinking of an example where the advocate said, here's what the judges keep saying to victims in our community about order for protections when there's kids. You both need to work this out, right? Clearly they don't, when they say that, this is what happened. The woman I'm working with just sinks because she knows that there's no way for her to work it out with him because there's never been a way to work it out with him. And now it's her responsibility to do that, right? And then when I work with women and I bring them back to court because he won't do something that he was supposed to do, then she starts getting judged because she keeps bringing the case back to court, right? Well, she keeps bringing it back to court because she can't work it, right? So advocates, when they do this over and over and over again and see the same patterns happening, they can provide a ton of insight into what some of the themes are that maybe an individual woman wouldn't notice in her experience, but somebody sees working with one woman after another going through that particular system. So focus groups with advocates are extremely valuable, as are. It's not like one or the other. It's you want to do both. And so this just kind of helps us understand the process of problem solving, right? So you identify and document a problem. The criminal justice system says, we got a problem. The advocates say, there's a problem you should look into. You end up working with a victim and the victim says, this is a problem that has happened to me more than once when I entered into this agency, right? So you got to expand the understanding of that problem. This is where your focus groups come up with, right? They come up with focus groups, you interview advocates, you track the system, you map out how a case gets processed through the police department. You do all these different things to really understand the scope of what produces this problem for the person who conveyed it to you, right? And then you have the sources, right? Then you can name where the source of this problem comes from. Once you have that, right, now you can approach decision makers with a proposal to change. But again, at that point of proposing change, if they say, yeah, in principle, we're okay with this, then you want to go back to the victims. And every time we do a series of focus groups, it's an ongoing change process in the system. We will ask women if they want to participate in an ongoing advisory group. And maybe a quarter of the women that we talk to want to do that. So that becomes the advisory group. We'll go back to the advisory group with that plan and say, did we get it right? Are we thinking the wrong thing here? Help us understand what to do with this. And I'll give you an example. We have a no contact statute in Minnesota that women aren't, as victims, any victim is not going to be told what that one of these gets issued at the first appearance in court. So we want to make sure victims had some input into this if they wanted to. So a colleague of mine and I sat down, and we, in all of our genius and expertise, sat down and wrote this piece out. And then we went to our advisor group and we said, this is what we're proposing to be given to victims at the scene so that they know that they can have input into this if one of these no contact orders is put in place. What do you think? And I remember a woman, she picked it up, she looked at it, and she basically threw it back on the table and she said, I'm never going to read that. I said, really? Why? Thinking I was all proud of, what we put together. And she said, because it's too long. It's 2:00 in the morning. My husband just got taken to jail. My kids are upset and they're up, and I have a job to do tomorrow, and I don't have vacation time. So I've got to get up, and at 7 a.m. and get to work. And you give me a 2-page thing to read? It's not going to happen, right? So then we said, well, would you be willing to take this and rewrite it so that it fits what you would actually look at and read? And so that group of women rewrote that piece, and now it's on every police card that's given out at a domestic, and it's written by women for women at the scene of a domestic, right? That's the work. That's what we want to achieve. Then you go to work group meetings, really finalize those solutions, draft that initial proposal for change, check with experts. There's experts all over the country who do different things, right? I get requests every single day for people to, would you look at this, right? Could you give me feedback? Ask for people feedback around the country to see if you're on the right track. Promote, get everybody on board, and then you train, right? We don't train at the front end. We don't believe the training deficit is the problem. We believe that it's a structural problem. We're going to change the structure, and then we're going to train people as to why we change that structure and how we've changed it, right? And then we implement it, and then we track it, and then we go back 6 months later or a year later, depending upon the change, to see if it actually had the impact that we hoped it would when we designed it, right? So that requires another set of focus groups, right? We are going back to the next group of women who are subject to that police policy, for example, to see, did this actually have the impact that we hoped it did? That's the ongoing nature of social change. We don't get a grant, we finish the grant, and we go do something else, right? We're constantly reviewing and changing what we've created as we learn from the people we serve.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to try to sort of get through them in a good order here. And I see two that are related. So one is, are you working with municipalities? Is there a model implemented which can be adapted to others? So quick answer to that, or easy answer, is yes. So this model has been adapted and can be adapted in other cities in both Global Rights for Women and DAIP have helped other communities to do this, to develop a CCR in a community that will then go through this process. And a related question, Scott, is what other major cities are following this Duluth method? So,
You know, uh, that's probably the downside of this, is that we trained a whole bunch of folks in Atlanta, um, and we did that at the beginning of, or it was about a year ago. And now we just heard from them that they're wanting to move to the next step, right? Um, it takes a long time. Now, what I can't say Atlanta is using this, right? But there's groups in Atlanta who are working within their frameworks, their jurisdictions, and trying to build these things. Gold Coast in Australia has a brilliant CCR that they're working, that they model after our work. So yeah, I mean, there are places that we've trained, that we've worked with, but I can't say today that if you called them, right, it fell apart, they lost their money, or they're still doing the work. I don't know. We don't have a way of tracking that. It's too many people in too many places for us to be able to, and we have too few people to track.
yeah, I guess a couple other examples. We've used this process in the country of Georgia and ended up developing a risk assessment tool to be used by police, and are just, they're at the stage where they want to do an evaluation of that now. So it's been long enough that they can kind of look back and see how this is working. So we hope to be able to support that work potentially to evaluate how the process has worked in Georgia. And I don't know, Scott, I guess the blueprints are examples, St. Paul and Duluth. Do you want to talk a little bit about the blueprint?
Yeah, so the blueprint for safety was something developed by Ellen when she was at Praxis International, which is a national technical assistance project. And it was developed based on her work in Duluth, working here. So a lot of what's in the blueprint is what's in Duluth. And so that became a federally funded initiative for a number of years. And there are what they call blueprint communities around the United States that are trying to implement the policies and protocols in the way that we've been talking about. One of the nice things is that they've done a lot of the focus group work up front in developing a lot of what they do, as we have. So that can save some time. But here's the one qualifier I would put on that. You might know that in general that is a best practice, but you don't know how that best practice is going to play out for women in your community, right? So it does not by any means replace the focus groups in your community. Find out what is the landscape there, and especially what is the landscape if you start doing this rather than what has been happening before. So yeah, that is another option. I can't say, I suppose I could look at the chat, but then I think we're both looking at it and then.
Yeah. So there's a question that was asked quite a while ago about mandatory arrest policies. So I'll just read it out. As you mentioned regarding mandatory arrest in Duluth, I live in Ontario, Canada, and we have mandatory charging for domestic violence. Police are required to lay criminal charges if there is a reason to believe violence abuse has occurred. This is incredibly controversial, and I'm wondering if you have encountered systems that have mandatory charging and the impacts on victims, and if you think it is necessary, beneficial to have mandatory charging policies within CCR.
Do we have another webinar? Because that's about how deep this one goes. Okay, so as quickly as I can. If you're going to get a batterer, somebody, this is the word that comes out of the women's movement here. In Australia, it's perpetrator. But however your country names this problem of ongoing violence, intimidation, the stuff that's going on in the power control wheel, that's oppression, that's dominating violence. That person is not going to voluntarily go into a process of rehabilitation and stay there without leverage, right? If you don't have leverage, you don't have a program, right? Now, I know that in Australia, they don't have all, they don't, they get men coming in that volunteer. We get men who volunteer too, but not to the extent they do. So this might work differently in other places, and maybe in Canada, you'll get more men just volunteering to come in and do that work. But typically, you need some form of leverage to get these guys into the program. So if there are, now here's where we're trying to deal with some of the controversies around it. Here in Minnesota, in Duluth, men who get arrested for domestic assault, if it's a first-time offense, if it's a lower offense, if it's a really bad case, that kind of stuff, they will plead that thing out to a stay of adjudication, which means the offender will plead guilty to the misdemeanor domestic assault, for example. But the judge will stay adjudicating that in lieu of going to whatever rehabilitation program is required. Chemical dependency evaluation and treatment, men's nonviolence programming and treatment. If there's mental health that was required, that treatment. Like they have to, if they do all of that stuff, right, and they successfully complete it, then the case goes away, right? It's as if it never happened. Whereas, which is different than arresting somebody, convicting them, and then sending them to the program. And we obviously have that also. But if you don't have mandatory arrest, then the question is, what's the alternative, right? And the alternative was what was existing before that, which is women had to make a citizen's arrest. And there are places where that's still the case, and there are no domestic violence cases because women don't feel safe standing before an officer like it would have to be here and put your hand on their shoulder and say, I'm making a citizen's arrest in front of an officer. It's not safe to do that. It won't happen. So, so how do you deal with the power imbalance that is created between the offender and the victim in that space, right? I think in Northern England, for those of you in England, when I was over there last, they were testing out something in the north where they were leveraging the individual's housing. So law enforcement would say, we could arrest you, but we're not going to, in lieu of you going to a rehabilitation program. But if you don't go, not only will we arrest you, but you could lose your housing on top of it. So that was a way to leverage them into a rehabilitation program to keep them in a process they didn't want to be in. So again, we're not just thinking mandatory arrest in a vacuum. We're thinking about how does mandatory arrest play into the larger goal of creating a safer community. It is not about arresting and convicting and jailing. That is not what it's about. It is a tool that you can use to circumvent the power imbalance at the scene, right? Pull the person who's causing the danger out of that space, right? For at least a temporary amount of time, and then find a way to leverage that time that's hanging over his head to get him into a process he doesn't want to go to initially, right? So it's really part of a larger way of organizing change in your community. It is not just, like I said, lock them up, convict, and jail. That doesn't change anybody. Ellen Pence had a saying that one of my favorite sayings of hers was, men go to prison and they find Jesus, but they never find respect for women, right? This is not where the change is going to take place. So it's going to take place in a community program, but we have to have leverage to get them to go. And that's where typically it comes from in the United States.
Scott, there's a somewhat related question. How effective do you find restorative justice practices and reconciliation in domestic violence that are being used within or with the Duluth model? This is being implemented in various communities. And then isn't Duluth a standalone model? I'm not sure about that second part of the question. So if you can clarify that, Gabriella, that would be great. But if you could speak to the restorative justice piece, Scott.
Yeah, so one of our community NGOs has Menace Peacemakers, is the agency that has coordinated our restorative domestic violence response. And that's been going for close to 15 years. Most of that time we've spent trying to figure out how to do it better. And we've had to change things within the restorative practices, the traditional restorative practices, to make it work. Again, that's a little longer conversation, but Men as Peacemakers, Duluth, Minnesota, is the one who runs it. Chris Godsey is the person who coordinates that program, and he would be thrilled with anybody who got in contact with him in order to ask your questions. So, and they're the experts. They're the ones that coordinate that program.
Okay.
Let's see. They're asking for Men as Peacemakers to be put in the chat.
I can look that up. Well, let me look at this question really quick. You will put Men as Peacemakers website in the chat, as well as maybe a link to the blueprint, because people have questions about what's included in that. Have you ever worked with victims of child marriage? I know a high percentage of underage women experience domestic violence if they are wed young. How do you work with them, since technically they're still minors and do not have many places to go? So this is not as much of an issue in the United States as it is in many countries in the world, and in some countries where Global Rights for Women does work. We have not worked on child marriage as a CCR issue. We have worked on it related to legal reform. So, legal analysis suggesting changes in the law that might better protect children who are married young. And I would also just add that I think the parallel in the United States, before coming to Global Rights for Women, I worked in immigration law and youth law, and saw a number of cases, or worked with a number of girls who had been sexually exploited. So it wasn't a marriage situation, but a similar sort of situation where, for example, if a girl was leaving home because of abuse, that she might end up with an older male partner and then experience sexual exploitation, not through marriage, but through that relationship. So I think there's, in the US also a long ways to go on that issue. Minnesota did start a process, passed legislation to try to protect girls who are being trafficked or sexually exploited, and also created a coordination system that basically establishes different regional navigators all across the state who are, basically coordinating with all of the service providers that serve youth in who are being sexually exploited. So that's kind of a similar model to CCR, in that they were developing protocols and policies to try to ensure that every youth that was in need of services would get what they needed, and would essentially, what they called it was, they would essentially have no wrong door. So that's an example here in Minnesota. There is a lot of child marriage in the US. Yes, I know in some communities there are. I would say in the communities in Minnesota, we haven't seen that as much, at least in the communities that we worked in. But thank you, Michelle, for saying that. I'm going to try to find these other websites to put in the chat. So Scott, if you have anything else to add, please go ahead.
There. Okay.
Or if you want to check the other questions in the chat.
Yep. Without breaking anything, right?
Yes, without breaking anything. Or if anyone else has questions, please add.
I understand that generally women are victims, but there is a smaller percentage of men that are victims of violence, and women are the abusers. Do you work with them? We do. We have a women's nonviolence program. So here's the thing that you have to be able to navigate to figure out: what is the intent of the violence that's being used? Most of the violence that we see men using is, and getting arrested for, and coming to the attention of the system, is ongoing patterned use of violence, intimidation to dominate an intimate partner. That's what we see. That's the intent. most of the violence that we see from women in relationships with men is resistive violence. So it still could be illegal. She may be acting in self-defense. If that's the case, no crime. But if she's not acting in self-defense, then what is her intent, right, behind the violence? And when you do focus groups with women who've been arrested for domestic assault, you hear a much different narrative than you do if you do a focus group of men who've been arrested for domestic assault. In fact, the women's group that we run, when that particular group is a closed group, the way we run that. And so when the woman who facilitates that program goes around at the first meeting and just everybody kind of talks about what got them there, the women just go right around the room and I did this, 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 right? They just say it, right? You go to an orientation with men who are into this program, and you'll be lucky that you get a guy who actually believes that they should be in the group at all, much less having done anything wrong, right? It's an entirely different mindset. So one of the things that you have to do as a community, I think, is right from the point of law enforcement, when they go to the scene and there are probable cause injuries on both parties, they have to have guidance. They have to have a way to unpack that and figure out who it was, either party acting in self-defense. If somebody was acting in self-defense, there is no crime, right? But if both parties were acting illegally, then who is the predominant aggressor in this scene, right? Who is the person who's most likely to continue to cause harm between the two people? That's the person who gets taken into custody. The other person might still get charged, right? That will be reviewed by prosecution, but this person will be taken into custody and charged, right? But if you don't give officers that understanding at the scene, then they're going to struggle. So here's an example. A man, one of our first cases in Duluth, under this policy that I just talked about. A man has beaten this woman quite badly. She's bleeding from both her eyebrows, her nose, her lips. Blood is smeared on her face, and he has not been assaulted at this point. So officers come, they get him under control, they get him in handcuffs. The minute they have him in handcuffs, she picks up a coffee cup off the counter and walks up and throws it at him and hits him right in the cheek, right? Now, in the police report that the officer wrote at that scene at this, he said, with the naked eye, I could see that there was a drop of blood on his cheek, but my camera could not pick up the blood on a photo, okay? The other woman's face is smeared in blood. Both are misdemeanor domestic assaults under our statute. She was not acting in self-defense. She was not under imminent threat, and she used an act of violence against a domestic partner. That is a crime, right? So I can't go to law enforcement and say, don't arrest him or don't arrest her, because don't you understand? She's a victim of what he did to her, right? That was a crime. Where we need to organize is with prosecution, because prosecutors in our country are the ones who make determinations about what is justice, right? So what is just for the man who's been beating her for years and beat her again tonight? What is justice for the woman who picked up the coffee cup, who's been beaten for years and hit him with it, right? So then how do prosecutors now treat similar crimes dissimilarly and legally justify it? So again, I have something else to put in the chat. It would be helpful, but is there a way we can upload things after this?
I don't think there is. I think what we should do is, Scott, can you please put your email address in the chat in case people want to follow up with specific questions?
Sure.
I did that. I will do that as well. We are out of time, so I want to be respectful because I know that some of you have other sessions you're going to now or other work to do. And we really appreciate everyone joining us today, all of your wonderful questions. Wish this could have been more of a conversation, but please enjoy CSW. And hopefully we will see you again in the future. Oh, and I see you can post files in the event announcement. We can try to post whatever Scott wants to post. We'll add there, so be sure to check back later on.
What I'm going to post is a paper written by one of our prosecutors on how legally it can be legally justified to treat similar crimes similarly when you have two people arrested for domestic assault and are under our laws. So you can see what an example of that would look like.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good luck to you, and thank you for your work.
Goodbye.